um, I don't necessarily mean literally, but direction, um, enjoying people, seeing the face of God in other people, all the things become much easier.
Great. Great.
I wrote a book about 43 years ago called Packing the Hearse, beep, beep. And I got this picture of this very big hearse that was around town. Was kind of beaten up by then already. And, the cover was going to be everything's hanging out the windows. Everything you own is in the hearse somewhere. And it's sort of a comedy. It's sort of an Irma Bombeck twist on things and on, emptying and filling and where you're going with it and all that.
Wow, it sounds like you need to get some copies for us.
It would need a lot of revisions.
Only 43 years worth of updating, right?
Yeah, I haven't even looked at it for 25 years. But that poem that I gave you is kind of in that same vein about packing the hearse, beep, beep. About tours of homes. And when I was growing up, whenever you visited anybody's home, you went on a tour of that person's home. That was part of hospitality.
Sure.
And then everything was pointed out, and I still do that. I don't know why. It's not because I'm proud of the things, but just want them to feel at home, I guess. But, it's kind of a funny thing to do. But anyway.
So has anybody, recently moved into a smaller place? I know some people from Advent Square may have experienced that. And I know the Deals did that a few years ago. How did that feel?
Rita.
Oh, yeah.
Madam Rita.
I'm doing the reverse. I was increasing my material things. I was coming from my daughter's house and going into an apartment with basically nothing. So I was increasing my material things. I had nothing to leave.
Oh, you're the opposite. Most people.
I'm the opposite, yes.
She said.
Mickey had to do some serious downsizing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a whole house.
Yeah, a big house. Yeah. And many years in that house.
Almost nothing. Yes.
And it isn't.
But
it isn't easy. We're probably built to gather things. So this isn't meant to say, oh gosh, how easy it is to let go of things. But St. Francis gives us an image of someone who did it radically. Maybe we are called to do it in our own way, and whatever that might look like. But the reason to do it is not because God would love us more, but we might find more freedom. We might find more joy if things didn't own us, or if we could let go of some things that probably don't serve us very well. I think I've been working on past, just sort of figuring out how to let go of some of my past, not necessarily bad stuff, but just stuff that I don't really need to carry around. It's an interesting feeling. Sometimes it feels great, and then sometimes it doesn't feel so great. So we're all on that journey together. Tonight, we're going to look at the next chapter of Living the Gospel. And when I say live the gospel, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to live the gospel?
For me, it was just to simply, imitate Jesus.
Yeah. And when did that concept make sense to you, Doug? Early on, later on?
Earlier, because it was just, quite frankly, the simplest way to understand the gospel.
Ah,
right? So, I really didn't have to know a whole lot about every aspect of it or all the various contexts or translations or anything like that. But if I could always just keep concept of Jesus is the gospel in mind, and at any given moment, all I really had to focus on was what would Jesus do? What did Jesus do?
mm-hmm.
And use that as the guide. So when Francis is talking about, look at the gospel for truth. Now I got to go back and not take Jesus out of it, but look for all the truth that Jesus spoke in you know in the creation of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
There's
that
the
was
actions. There's the action, and then he also has the message. And so,
yes.
yes, but
So I would have
you're not
I
in
would
bad
have interpreted the gospel as actions initially,
Sure.
and then after reading this chapter, I'm seeing it as truth and reflecting on it as truth when I'm reading it now.
Okay. Well, you are a blessed person to have seen that earlier in life, even if you think it was a simple thing. It seems far from simple for most people, I think. To what else does gospel bring up to you, other people?
I- Go ahead, Linda.
To me, it brings the church. I mean, just this morning, where he
Can't hear.
can hear me, where he talks about the church being the evidence of love. The church is, the church is God's little world. It's the world of Jesus. Everybody in the church belongs to him. Everything belongs to him. So the whole church belongs to him. When I'm with a gang of church people, I can literally feel love.
Mm,
Even if everybody's acting a fool. I mean, people wear a bigger heart when they are at the feet of Jesus.
mm.
They just have bigger hearts, and they know what to do with them. They don't carry junk in there. Just, I don't know, whatever.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's the joy and grace that you get from the good Christian. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Christian fellowship is so valuable. It's always been one of the significant efforts for me in ministry. That because I just believe what you're saying, Linda, being around each other is good. It's good to be, it could be, making chili and tasting chili. It can be worshiping, it can be serving together, but there is a definite blessing from being around other people of faith. And I guess that's partly because whatever we lack in our following of Jesus, they might make up for.
And even St. Francis felt that. That's why he, joined with other brothers so they could share the down part and share the lifted up part,
Exactly. So the gospel is imitation of Christ. The gospel is the fellowship of believers. Other thoughts?
I always think of the Matthew 5, 6, 7, that we've been studying.
Mm-hmm.
And like you gave that one time, when you did the 10,000 foot view, it's, light, we're supposed to be light and salt and not judging and all the things that he tells us to watch out for, and kind of lays out a path that looks beautiful, but none of us can really follow directly because we keep falling off and stumbling. But it's still like a guideline of if we were going to imitate. I mean, I guess this is like what Francis did. He saw this path that Jesus laid, and he was a lot better in being able to do exactly what he said than I can.
That's great. And that idea that you're mentioning now, you're way ahead of me, Daryl. That's exactly where we're going tonight with with Matthew 5, because that's the thing that is clearly how St. Francis heard the gospel. Well, let's look, because well, maybe I'll just say we didn't get to it yet, but if some people heard the word gospel, they would hear this word: for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. That would be the gospel to most people. Now, I love that verse, right?
Absolutely.
That God so loves the world that he gives his only son. But here's the sticker with this: whoever believes in him shall not perish. So when we use a verse of the Bible like that so significantly, what might we give as an impression to people that the gospel is in its totality? It's considered like the gospel in a verse. This would be very Protestant for those of you who are Protestants out there. What do we have to do?
Acknowledge him and love him.
Yeah, we have to
Accept
believe.
him.
Faith,
Yeah.
right? So gospel for a Protestant is going to be God's grace brings about your faith. And your faith essentially gives you the entree into God's grace. So this is a very heady idea of the gospel, right? Now, for many of us, this is the only gospel we would know. Now, Teresa, however, she knows a different gospel, or at least she grew up with it. Dave too, except he skipped church more than Teresa did. And that is, be good, and your heavenly Father will bless you. You know, seek righteousness, holiness, rightness with God, and God will most certainly then respond with salvation. Now you see that's different in the sense, and I pick on Teresa because the Catholic view, of course, would be doing the right things. The gospel is when you do the right things, you most certainly will be blessed. For Protestants, the gospel is when you trust in Jesus, you most certainly will be saved. And we didn't talk about either of those in our first comments. Neither of those got brought up. And yet those are the fundamental ways that we understand. And I think not in any way to critique those, because they are elements of this relationship we have with God, of course. But I think Francis helps us explore something that is that takes us to a different level, one that might, that I think will be a blessing to us as well. So let's look at this. I'm going to share my screen. Hi, Russell. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is from Thomas Solano. Thomas Solano wrote the first
Good morning, brother.
life. Good morning. The first life of St. Francis. It was wonderfully accomplished within something like 15 to 20 years of his death. And it was done by the urging of one of the bishops who wanted to make sure that a straightforward, truthful telling of the life of St. Francis made it out there, partly because these were days when most people didn't participate in written documents, reading, writing. And so they were telling a lot of stories about St. Francis, a lot of stories, some of which we still have, but just all sorts of stories. And the bishop was concerned that they would, they needed a biography that was a little more stable. and not so fanciful. Because, you know, in history, making up stuff about people is not considered, you know, wrong. You can make up stuff about other people. I mean, we don't think about that today quite as much, because, you know, that idea that you could tell a story about Pastor Andy that isn't true, that you'd be welcome to do that. He was like, well, no, he didn't do that. But that wasn't the case for the stories told about saints and famous people. You could make up any story you want. It generally wouldn't get very far if it didn't seem to fit the nature of the saint or the person. So in other words, if it seemed to contrast, like if someone had told a story about St. Francis where he was a serial killer, that probably would not have gone anywhere. But a lot of stories being made up that showed his great faith and some of them were probably embellished. So Solano writes these words: his greatest care, this is about St. Francis, greatest care, I love all these words, greatest care, most vivid desire, supreme resolution was to observe the holy gospel always and in everything, and with all vigilance and care, with all of his mind's desire and his heart's fervor. Wow, I mean, he wanted he wanted to follow the teachings and imitate the examples of our Lord Jesus Christ to perfection. To perfection. So what jumps out at you with that statement?
He's trying to attain something he's never going to get to.
Extremely passionate, yes.
Passionate.
Very difficult to attain, yes.
Mhm.
But his only goal seemed to be pushing at himself. He doesn't seem to be marketing the way, his idea of the way to God. Unless I'm missing something.
He does want to share his way to God.
Right.
He does. Okay.
He does, but he does it in such a way as an offering. I offer this. It's not a I'm not going to judge you over this unless you choose to follow me. If you choose to be in my brotherhood and you do that with all seriousness, then I will hold you accountable. But the average person, I'm not going to judge. But if you want to experience this, you're going to have to follow the rule that would help you do it. It would be similar to a person going to physical therapy for their back, and the trainer says, okay, I only can help you as much as you participate in this therapy. And the person says, well, frankly, I'm just going to sit here for an hour. I don't want to do it. I mean, I don't want to do it. So what would happen? He said, well, you said you wanted to come to physical therapy. No, I didn't. Someone sent me. Oh, okay. Well, then I guess, fine. But if you want to get better, do you want to get better? Yeah, I want to get better. Well, then you're going to have to do something. Oh, well, yeah. So there's a difference. And I think what you picked up, BB, is that he has no judgmentalism to this. He wouldn't condemn you if you did. He doesn't condemn you that you haven't given all of your worldly goods away and taken off all your clothes in the middle of Meisner Park.
Yeah.
She'd get attention.
I'm glad about that.
So
Yeah, and he's not pushing others. He's doing it himself as an example.
Yes.
yep. And the only time he would hold you accountable is if you asked for that. You asked to be accountable. You say, I want you to tell me, Francis, how to do this better. So I love the whole it's a pretty simple, I think it's a one sentence summary, but how much richness there is in there. And the idea is that now, so when did this switch flip for St. Francis? This is not easy for me to answer. St. Francis was some kind of believer, but he also was a trust fund kid.
I
So-
think after he was imprisoned,
I
and went
agree,
home,
yeah,
he spent
yeah.
another year rehabilitating or
Yeah, I
trying to
agree.
gather himself, and then it seems like then.
And didn't he wonder why nobody visited him?
Yes, he felt very abandoned.
Yeah.
It's possible that his father delayed the ransom to teach him a lesson, although at this point in time, Francis hadn't displeased his father really. But then there is the second effort to go on a crusade where he turns around and, within a day and, says that now I've got a voice talking to me. The father doesn't really go for that. Somewhere in that first imprisonment and the return home, before he goes on that ill-fated crusade, he begins talking with Jesus, or Jesus begins talking with him. He doesn't say a lot about it. It's the black, proverbial black box. But I think we will find that for many people, there's a particularly dark time where God seems to show up, and that becomes a moment where things change. Anybody had an experience like that where if anything, God seemed really distant, but then in the midst of that, all of a sudden God came very close?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And did it flip everything, or did it flip something for a little while and then?
Yeah.
I mean, pretty clearly for Francis, it was the 180 for the rest of his life. Some people, they might turn a new direction, but then kind of fade back into it, the old path. There might be a journey, a different, a more like most of us take that journey where we're kind of going in the right direction, and then we
When things start getting very, very comfortable, I think the average human being sort of gets a little bit relaxed from that concept, whereas he maintained the lifestyle that constantly promoted God being in control of this world, not him or us.
That's great. Yeah. G.K. Chesterton, an English writer, about 100 years ago, wrote a St. Francis. It's a biography, but it's very much it's less worried about each detail than ideas around St. Francis. He used an image that I thought was incredible, and I haven't shaken it, so I want to give it to you and see what it means to you. He said St. Francis was one of those few people who started digging into the earth, and he dug down and down and down and down and down until at some moment all of his efforts were now going up.
Ah,
Wow.
then you come out the other side.
Yeah. And he said what Chesterton says is that we're very thrilled that St. Francis did this, because very few of us can go down so far intentionally that we end up finding ourselves going up. I just can't shake that image. I think that really fits the American experience, where we just don't need to go so deep. We don't need to go to such depths, because really things are very likely to get better in the next economic cycle, or the next job or whatever. But this idea that St. Francis did that, I think is fascinating. So for St. Francis, following Jesus did not become something that was a duty. It became his will now.
His life.
Yeah, it's what I want, what I want. I'm no longer, saying, what does God want of me? I know what I want now, what God wants, which is remarkable. So his most vivid desire, I just love that. So what was the gospel to medieval lay people and leaders? I think this is really important because it helps us understand the context. And that's what I was doing for us earlier on, saying what's the gospel to us. Let's look back at the Middle Ages. It might be more helpful. For lay people, for the non-religious priests, nuns, and monks, it meant getting clean of your sins. This was your duty. You were constantly gathering up your debts, and I think debts is a good word for this. You were guilty of trespasses. You were adding to your pile of sin, and what you needed to do was to keep lightening yourself of this load. Your duty was to keep lightening yourself. Obviously, it helped if you didn't commit so many sins, but ironically, what we'll find in a way that really wasn't as much the emphasis as getting rid of them became. So you can even find indulgences that were sold, these purchased get out of sin free cards for those actions that you were going to commit. You could buy them in advance. So,
Oh boy.
you want to get clean of the sins because you didn't want to go to hell. Hell was very real. Hell was it was all the bad stuff of life worse. And very shortly after this, Dante captures all that in the Inferno and in that imagery, which has become our main imagery of hell, has to do with really Dante's understanding his images.
It's really very good. Everybody really needs to reread it.
Yeah, rewrote.
It's good.
Yeah. So you also, even if you weren't hellbound, you were most certainly going to spend time in what place?
That purgatory?
Purgatory, yeah. Where you would purge yourself of whatever,
but only certain levels
that you hadn't, hadn't been successful with. So, how did you do this? How do I get clean of my sins? Well, Jesus is the treasurer. He got all of the grace credits for dying on the cross. So he's at the poker table. He's got all the chips. All right. So you need to work it out with Jesus. Okay. And I want to tell you, this was not necessarily a friendly relationship. It wasn't like Jesus just wanted to hand over to you all this forgiveness. He wasn't necessarily eager, but he would make a deal with you. If you did certain things, then, certain things will be forgiven. So clearly worship. Now, worship meant going to church, sitting through a service in a language you didn't understand, or maybe standing because they didn't bother letting you sit. And it meant something very significant, getting the body of Christ. Getting the body of Christ, getting the bread. Real important. Your praises, your prayers, if you learned anything, not particularly important. What's important is that wafer, that bread, because it's for forgiveness of sins. So the goal of a Catholic, get to church and get that bread. Now you'd ask Protestants today, why do you go to church? I go for the music, the praising. I go for the message, learning. But you won't hear very many Protestants say, I go to get the bread. You know, we don't understand it quite that same way, although we say the words, this is for your forgiveness. We don't, but
Bread, they say, bread.
there is no purpose, almost no purpose to that mass more significant. There is no purpose more significant than getting that bread. And those of you who grew up Catholic know how important getting that bread is, how sacred that bread was, how many churches you couldn't touch it, it had to be put in your mouth,
Right.
lest you take it home and who God knows what with it. It's the body of Christ. You've got to go and you've got to get it, and you've got to get it from a priest. So the priest is your, you know, he's got the keys.
He blesses it.
He's got the keys. He's the only one that can make it communion. In our church, that is a little different now. When I grew up, only the pastor would do communion, but sometimes we'll have, you know, people do communion on a retreat, or we know in emergencies at the hospital. But this is so important. Gotta go to mass. And for many people today, the reason to go to mass is essentially to get that forgiveness. The other thing is confession, you know, to actually express those sins, have them heard, have them, some kind of a, it's not a punishment. It's an action that shows you are contrite, right, Teresa? An act of contrition. And that means to say, this person just confessed their sins. They're told they'll receive their forgiveness, but that's based on, did they really mean it? And the way we can tell if they really meant to confess their sins was they complete their act of contrition. So it gets a little confused. Some people think you're doing the Hail Mary to get forgiveness. And I think probably through the centuries, many people, but what was meant to do is to say, no, you'll receive forgiveness, but we just want to make sure you actually confessed. You didn't just show up and say stuff. You meant it. Now I know you meant it because you did the rosary. Now I know you meant it because you abstained from fish for 7 weeks or whatever, or from meat. Confession, real important. Pilgrimages, going to places where there were holy sites meant merit. You got merit. By doing that, you were wiping out purgatory time. So these pilgrimages are really important. At the end of St. Francis's life, he is dying. He is clearly, it's the end of his life. He's dying. He's really sick. And they're doing everything they can to get him back to Assisi. Why are they so concerned about getting him back to Assisi? Assisi wants to be the St. Francis pilgrimage site. If Assisi gets the body, they're going to get pilgrims. If they get pilgrims, they're going to get visitors, money, attention. And it gets really dicey at the very end. They had to protect St. Francis as he was dying. People wanted to take pieces of his clothing or hair, because these all would be important in that medieval theology, in that medieval thinking. And then relics, you know, that would be the hair, the clothing. And if you've been on any trips, you know, you've seen places where they said this is the portion of the cross, or, you know, a portion of St. Peter's left pinky, or whatever it might be. Now, I think that there's something beautiful about relics, but certainly one has to be careful to think that they would be like supernaturally saving you from your sins. They might help you reflect on the life of that saint.
You can't turn into idols.
Right. Taking holy orders, you know, becoming a priest, becoming a nun, becoming a monk would be good for you and probably for your family. And that should be a good chance of a ticket to, you know, up. And then giving to the church. So one of the things about giving to the church is not just giving your tithes, but giving land, giving buildings, giving your wealth to the church. This is how the church over hundreds of years becomes one of the main landowners in Europe. And it isn't a landowner anymore because much of this land got taken back. In England, for example, one of the reasons Henry was thrilled to leave the Catholic Church, he took all the monastic lands back. He made bank when that happened because the church had so much. Now, what were the leaders' idea of the gospel? Certainly increasing the power and wealth of the church. I won't say there weren't spiritual desires for many of them, but certainly the church needs to be strong. And the church needs to continue to grow, and there's nothing new to that. Adding land and buildings, and then eventually the Crusades. The church is real concerned with having the ability to fund and go on these crusades. So this is the gospel understood by people on the ground in this time frame. Okay, this is how, when you hear the gospel, you think these things. These are the things. Quite
Andy,
different. Yeah.
This whole list are outward manifestations of what the gospel meant to these people. But to me, the gospel is actually an internal reinforcement of faith and belief. And are you implying that the gospel did not cover those items for the lay people?
I would say that it's always possible that there were many people who understood the gospel to be something that would be believed and change their life. You know, certainly when St. Francis did that, he wasn't the first. And when he did see it that way, he attracted people. In other words, people looked at this and they weren't finding, meaning. They weren't finding, and especially if they could read the gospel or if they could hear it. But remember, they're not hearing it in their language and they're not reading. So, I mean, the system is pretty clear. You want to make it to heaven, you need to do these things. And these things are doable. No one's able to really tell what your faith is, what your beliefs are. You certainly wouldn't be able to articulate them in any sophisticated way because there wouldn't be enough. Your vocabulary couldn't handle that. I mean, you're a simple peasant living and dying generation after generation. But
if you did every item on that list outwardly manifesting, but did not have the understanding, belief, and faith, you didn't really get anything out of the gospel.
So that's my point. I'm setting up what you'll see the difference. So it's sort of like, that was then, and then let's look at this is now here.
Question, Andy. How did they explain that confession was to a man? It was not an exploration of your heart or for forgiveness. It was telling some guy, and then you would take whatever consequence was assigned to you by a human being. And I never got that.
Well, that you were not in general able to approach, say you're a peasant, you would have no opportunity to approach a noble and never the king. So if you look at the medieval culture, you have no access to Jesus or to God. You would not have that access. Only access you can have to Jesus, to God, would be through your priest, would be through the merits or the kindness of the saints, especially like Mary, you know. But because the medieval society would tell you, you have no appeal to the king. You can't go to the king. And it is interesting that the Reformation doesn't really get ahead of steam until we see the weakening of kings. This at the end of that era, where the only way one could conceive of your station in life was as in this feudal system, you know, which puts you, it was a caste system. We talk about India caste system. We had, you know, feudal systems were a caste system. And so there's no other appeal. And you are told hell is a bad place, and you are you don't question if there's a God. That's another important thing. There's very few people questioning if there's a God. They just want to know how they get on the right side of this God. And these are the simple ways. And I'm not going to say that there wasn't God's grace being shown in their daily lives, or that they didn't have you know, some idea of the love of God. But clearly that doesn't seem to be the predominant understanding. And now this helps make clear what Francis sees. For Francis, living the gospel, and Doug said it earlier, was to kind of be like Jesus. This was sort of odd. Jesus was no one that you could be like. He was far away and scary and powerful. It would be like saying one day that because I want to be, I'm going to be like Bruce Springsteen. You know, I'm just going to walk around and be like Bruce Springsteen. I'm going to wear his clothes and, you know, carry his stuff around and act like him and get a New Jersey accent. And it's like, you know, that all of a sudden St. Francis is like, I want to talk like Jesus. I want to walk like Jesus. I want to be like Jesus. This one who very likely like reached into the depths and pulled him out and gave him meaning and purpose. So he embraces the leper. Lepers, we've said many times, wild that leprosy is still a problem all these years later and still seen as a social stigma, but it is. And yet he hugs the leper and he gives kindness to the leper. And then he ends up actually ministering to lepers, washing their wounds, caring for them, begging for them so that they have food. Nothing to do with lepers before this conversion. And he considers this his moment of conversion when he did the love of the leper, giving everything away. We talked about that already, but this is the idea of Jesus had nothing. I want to have nothing. I don't want to be like somebody else. I want to be like him, you know. Preaching the good news. That means that, you know, as much as Francis likes to spend his personal one-to-one time with Jesus, he asks his leaders, and he asks Claire, what should I do with my life? Should I go off and, you know, have this relationship by myself with the Lord, which I love, I cherish, or should I go preaching? And Claire says, you must preach. You must go. And so all of the disciples, there's no cloistering in Franciscan the rule. There's no idea that you convert to faith in Christ and then you spend the rest of your life alone praying, you know, on behalf
No monastery, huh?
Right. And especially the ones that the hermits, the ones who took that on as the rest of their life. Now, Francis was very tempted by this though. And he probably had that spirituality. He escaped a lot, but then again, look at the images of Jesus, right? Jesus going off, you know, to be with God. He started rebuilding God's church. He heard this command to rebuild God's church. Now, was this a metaphor that this monk would help lead people to a sense of the gospel that was radically different from what they were experiencing? Or was it literally to rebuild churches? Well, he took it literally and he started fixing up churches, but probably in the end, it was bigger than that. And the Pope has a dream that the big Catholic Church in Rome is tipping over, and a little monk comes up and puts his shoulder to the collapsing cathedral and props it up. And then he looks at the face of the monk and it's Francis. Forgiving his enemies. This is an interesting thing. The idea of his culture would be in no way, shape, or form forgiving. It would be similar to the Hatfields and McCoys. So, for example, Assisi and Perugia were constantly at each other, hating each other. The life of these villages, these towns, these territories, constantly at war for land from each other, for power over each other. This idea of forgiving would certainly have been alien to his life, and yet, he sees it. And when people start to, bother him, he actually rejoices. He actually rejoices in the persecution. So this is bringing me closer to Jesus, who was persecuted. Seeking humility, peacemaking. We'll get to some of those a little later, but certainly this is not visiting relics. This is not focusing on your pile of sins. Now, did he care about his sins? He did, and he certainly believed the Eucharist, the communion, was important for him, and took it a lot and encouraged churches to give it a lot. Some people weren't taking communion very often. We think of the Catholic Church as having communion daily, and that was not so for the average person. Not even taking it weekly would have been a thing. So he did believe in that, but these are the things that ended up being his concern. And to get back to what Daryl said earlier, the idea of the Beatitudes, blessed are you in these very strange circumstances that we trip through when we're reading the Gospels. But when you stop and you look at these, they just take your breath away. That Jesus says, the poor are blessed. The poor are blessed. They're the ones that receive God's favor. The meek receive God's favor. Those who mourn seek God's attention. Those who hunger and thirst after justice, they get reward from God. The merciful get mercy back. They live a different life. The clean of heart, the peacemakers, and those who suffer persecution for righteousness' sake. A whole, can I say, counterculture is intended here. We skip through this quite easily and move back to, again, what's the fundamental gospel? The fundamental gospel is believe in Jesus Christ. The fundamental gospel is perhaps, as I hear it said, I try to be good. Again and again, we fall back on that. So even ourselves can find ourselves guided by these debt-oriented, trespass-oriented understandings of the gospel, as if God does not want to really forgive us, does not want us to come to know him and to love him, but really what he wants to do is he wants to spend all his time being a heavenly accountant. Does one imagine the creator of the universe wants to be an accountant? That's really what he really set out. I'm going to create Steve Lane, And then the rest of his life, I'm going to keep track of all the mistakes Steve Lane made. There were at least three or four, right, Steve?
Exactly, at least.
Yeah. Can you imagine that would be the gospel? Here's your God. The good news of the gospel is that God is an accountant, or worse, he's a judge. All he's really interested in doing is to keep you on your toes. If you stay on your toes enough, he might, bring you into the heavenly fold. And yet, even in the Old Testament, that's not the only understanding of God. He's the good shepherd. He wants the sheep with it. He's the one who forgives Israel again and again and again. So is it so odd that someone like St. Francis, who actually listens to the gospel, actually hears it? He actually hears it. He said, well, I'm just reading this stuff. I'm just reading this. I don't know what's wrong, why this is so strange. I'm just reading it. But we trip by it. And maybe because none of these seem very pleasant. Or maybe they don't seem too enticing. But I think I'm in a crowd of people who actually look at these and say, oh yeah, this sounds good. This sounds like heaven. To know when you're at your least that he's there for you, and that's who he's working with. So Saint Francis, he took the Beatitudes seriously. What would it mean? Do you think Jesus meant us to take him seriously?
Of course.
Faith, in my opinion, you bring yourself to faith and then you grow in it. You have to grow in it. And when if we took a beatitude every 10 years and try to work on that one, I think part of Christianity is understanding that we're never going to be the perfect Jesus, but that's not the goal. The goal is to try to be like Jesus and to believe that kind of perfection comes only from God. And our best hope is to hit this world and go right to him, because we're never going to be able to manage it on our own.
Right. Yeah. And I think the idea of what we can get busy with is so beautiful here. I mean, now don't get me wrong, I'm happy to go on a pilgrimage. I hope someday to do the Camino de Santiago. I would love to do that. I'm looking at going to England and Scotland and Wales and going to beautiful churches, and I certainly will take a moment in those churches to venerate whatever history that church celebrates. I'm certainly concerned about receiving forgiveness through communion. I believe in it. It's one of the things that we try to we maintain as a distinctive thing for Advent, and I think that is something we just hold on to because it matters so much. But this idea that there's more than that now we live in kind of a new way, I think St. Francis just helps us see so clearly. Now, are we all meant to be like St. Francis?
No.
It would be surprising if God intended everyone to be St. Francis. I mean, who would St. Francis care for then, right? But we all can be inspired, right? we all can be inspired, just as he was inspired by Jesus. I think the idea that we can be imitators of Christ needs to continue to be brought back, and especially to Protestants, because we've been so taught to not to identify ourselves with holiness, like we're sinners, you know. See, but you know what? God makes us holy. And so in Lutheran theology, you're simultaneously a sinner and a saint. And I don't think we take seriously that we're simultaneously a saint, sainted by God. Therefore, we most certainly can do saintly things. We can make it a better world. We can bless our neighbor. We can, you know, do things that need doing, you know. The idea that we sort of rest comfortably in our sinner category is sort of like a false humility. Like, well, I'm just a sinner, you know, I'm not, well, you know, but you're a saint too, you know, you've been made holy by God. What does that mean for you? So this is the living the gospel that St. Francis illustrates in his life, that really challenges another series of definitions that maybe had such a grip. Now, you know, for those of us, again, in the Protestant world, we're going to see Luther look at the Catholicism of his day and say, I think we've lost track of something else, you know, we've lost track of grace. And so Luther's going to, you know, lift that up. And always there's going to be people who are noticing something we might be missing. I don't think we're done yet, you know. And the idea that any one church couldn't use reforming again is probably unlikely, you know. So do you think St. Francis would be a helpful voice for us today in our world?
Yeah.
Or
Yes,
is he
but
just-
not necessarily by total example.
Right.
The declothing is not part of today,
Streaker.
although it does seem to be happening, doesn't it? Young girls.
I keep going back in this chapter to the emphasis on truth. And I can't imagine a time in this world where truth has been so much in question than it is now, with everybody allowed to have their own truth.
Right. Right.
So I think that truth aspect of his message and his ministry is very germane to right now.
You know, I think the way that we'll heal division, now that we've identified it, you know, ad infinitum for a number of years, is for some people to just say, I know we're divided, but I just want to love people. I just want to love people. I don't agree with them one bit, but I just need to love them, you know. And, you know, I only think Christians could get there. I'm not sure how hopeful I am, but I know we could. I guess we all are. I think we all are the yeast and the salt and the light right now, you know, as we find that, you know, families are being torn apart and people are being canceled right and left, and you say, but not so among us, right? Or at least we hope not.
I don't think this world would have the capacity to love, you know, short of God's first love for us. So if you're not a believer, I think it'd be hard to muster up enough love in today's environment to love somebody that, you know, that is as unlovable as the rest of us. but our capacity to love through God's first love for us is what you said, Andy. It's only going to fall within the Christian's ability to do so.
Yeah. Any last thoughts, Dave, Teresa? Anything you pulled out of this?
You're good. Anything?
Just brought back a lot of memories of being raised Catholic, that's all.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Well, I'm a Catholic fan, but all churches have had their troubles, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing that, stands out to me is the fact, being raised Catholic, I was taught a vengeful God, and I didn't learn about a loving God till I came to Advent. So that was kind of a culture shock for me, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought what I got for the first time was that faith can be joyful. I never saw joy in my Christian friends. A lot of fear, like Dave said, but I never saw just joy from believing, from knowing Jesus.
Mm.
Saw that actual joy that can come from that. It's a choice. It's a choice. And if you have Jesus, you can have joy. You can choose joy. It's
Sure.
like, that's pretty good.
Yes.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about freedom. I mean, freedom, the liberation of, all the bondage that comes with trying to free yourself.
Mhm.
I mean, as a Catholic, I mean, that was, there were all these things we had to do, so there was freedom in knowing that Christ had already done.
Yeah.
There was nothing more I needed to add, and it brought the joy, that Linda talked about. So, there's so much freedom in just knowing the gospel and the truth, like Doug talked about, the true gospel, not one that, we were taught as kids different, differed from the Protestant thinking, so because there wasn't that freedom, so.
Well, I would say there are probably plenty of Protestant churches that people could tell you today that were legalistic in their experience. And so, clearly the thing missing would be the idea that we are loved by God and receive God's grace, wherever that is being lifted up, or however, we can't forget that for all the Protestant efforts, it's the Catholic Church that has these orders and supported these orders and allowed and supported Franciscans to go all around the world doing good work. So he wasn't really trying to reform the Catholic Church, but he certainly gave them something else to look at. And
Right.
To the credit of the popes, none of the popes opposed him, and the bishops didn't oppose him either. I think deep inside they were welcoming this reminder, like a good reminder, not an annoying reminder. Like, and I think he just must have been somebody everyone liked. I think in the end, there's something to that. Like, they just liked him. I mean, it was just like there was something about him that was, and I always think about that with Jesus, but you don't get that with Jesus because we have to keep him so holy. But if you are watching The Chosen, or if you watch some of the other shows that have been more recently done on Jesus, they've really done a good job in showing Jesus to be more like somebody you'd like to hang around with. I mean, I look at some of the movies about Jesus, I wouldn't want to hang around with that guy. It's like, But like I grew up with Godspell, and that was a Jesus that I thought was the bomb. I mean, to be around that Jesus, I mean, it probably is the most significant image for me. If you're not familiar with Godspell, he actually spends most of his time in what would be considered clown face, but he's a speaking clown and a singing clown and a dancing clown. But it's an image of joy, like you said, Teresa, and it's one that makes you want to be better. I mean, Christians don't just say, "Oh, it's so fun to have a fun God. I don't want to be better." No, it's you want to be better because the inspiration is given to you. Great. So on to next week, we'll be looking at St. Francis's work on the church itself, and that idea that he took it quite literally to fix the church. And some of you may have actually been to some of those churches. I hope to get there someday. But also what did it mean for the church that St. Francis was so loyal to it, actually. So let's end with our prayer. Uh-oh.
Sure, you'll find it in a hurry.
Yeah, just when I need it. I wonder if I knocked it out.
I know bits and pieces, but I can't remember it all.
There it is. Okay. All right.
It's page 35 in the book.
There we go. All right. Lord, make me an instrument
of your peace.
Your peace.
Where there is
There's
hatred, let me so love.
let me so love.
Where
Where there is
Where there's
injury,
pardon.
where there is doubt, faith.
Faith.
Where there is despair,
hope.
where
Where
there
there
is
is darkness, light.
Light.
Where there is sadness,
joy.
O
divine
Master,
grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love.
For
it is in giving that we receive,
it is in
it is in pardoning that we are pardoned,
and it
it
is
is
in
in dying that we are born to eternal life.
Thank you all.
Amen.
Appreciate you being here with us today, and God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.